Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Christina Denning. I'm with the USC Alumni Association as the Assistant Director of Regional and Engagement Programs. And we are so happy to have you here this evening for Unlocking Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Workplace. I will now go ahead and turn this over to Jimmy Coe, who is our Programming Director for the Young Alumni Council.
Thank you, Christina. Hi, and welcome everyone to our event this evening. Thank you all for joining. My name is Jimmy Coe, and I oversee the programming for our Young Alumni Council. And if you're unfamiliar, the Young Alumni is the specific demographic for USC's alum under the age of 35. And tonight we have a really exciting opportunity to hear from 3 USC alums who have contributed to, a very important topic that has been, kind of the focal point the last few months in our country. Before we begin, I did want to, take a moment. Today is Veterans Day. I wanted to thank any veterans that we have joining us today. Thank you for your service and, really allowing us to have the discussion that we're having tonight. So now, just to get started, I want to introduce our panelists. And we have Autumn Gupta and Brianna Wallace, co-founders of Justice in June, which they'll explain later on. And we also have Dr. Little. She's the Vice Dean and Senior Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer. So I guess in the order that we have on the slide, Dr. Little, would you like to go first to kind of give an introduction about yourself?
Well, thank you all so much, and I appreciate the invitation. I am Dr. Shirani Little, and I do currently serve as the USC Marshall School of Business Vice Dean and Senior Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer. I have been a professor at Marshall for over 20 years and really excited to be joining the Young Alumni Council to be part of this very important conversation. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Little. And Brianna, would you like to go next?
Hi, everyone. I'm Brianna Wallace. I graduated last year, class of 2019, with a BS in Business Administration alongside a dance minor and an entrepreneurship emphasis. So I also serve on the Young Alumni Council as a professional programming liaison. And now I work full-time in the beauty industry, working for a professional hair product company. So I'm a brand manager. I oversee innovation and product development. And when I'm not doing that, I'm doing all things Justice in June with my wonderful best friend, Autumn.
And that would lead us to Autumn.
Perfect. Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Autumn Gupta. I started at the same time as Brianna in 2015, and I just graduated this past May as class of 2020. An exciting time to graduate, to say the least. And because of that, so my background, I have degrees in environmental science and geodesign. So I do a lot of work with geospatial data. But at least for this current year, I've had to pivot a little bit in my post-grad life plans. And I am currently teaching 8th grade science to middle schoolers in a town a little bit from where I grew up. And so that is a very exciting challenge every day, but I enjoy getting to work with real humans and investing in our young people.
Great. Thank you all for sharing about yourselves. So the format for the event, we do have some questions ready for the panelists, but if you guys have any questions at all, feel free to leave them in the chat. And if it's, directly responding to something that they're talking about, I'll bring it up to the panelists. If not, we are going to save the last about 15, 20 minutes for any Q&A as well. But to get started, Autumn and Brianna, can you guys kind of explain how, Justice in June, a little bit about that and how that all got started?
Yeah, I'll start us off. So Justice in June really started with a conversation. It was catalyzed by the murder of George Floyd, which deeply affected me. I had spent a lot of time desensitized to a lot of the injustices that were happening across the nation, and this one resonated differently. And Autumn, at the time, so she lives in Missouri, I live in California, does not have social media, and I had shared on my social media a video of just how it was affecting me, to showcase, here's a tangible person that you follow because you love, care, or admire, and this is how it's affecting my life. And so I sent that to my parents, and I sent it to Autumn, and she was like, whoa, okay, let's break this down. Let's just have a conversation. Let's just talk about it. And that led us talking 2.5 hours on a Saturday evening, and then further leading to the next steps that would flow into Justice in June.
Yeah, and just to elaborate a little bit further on that, there was one line specifically, so Bree did send me this video she had shared, and the one line that was personally very convicting, so it took it from this really horrible event I saw in the news to like, oh wow, I have a role to play. And she says, if I was the one who died, would you be doing anything differently? Like, would your feed look different? Would the words, the conversations you're having look different? Would you be making calls? And I thought to myself, well, of course I would be. Like, you are my best friend. You are the most important people in my life. And I would be doing things dramatically different than what I had been doing. And then along with that, as a USC educated woman, I realized I felt a little bit ashamed that I didn't recognize 75% of the resources being circulated. And that meant I had work to do. So I've always been very type A. I love a schedule. I love a plan. And I was like, okay, cool. The month of June is coming up. I will just commit to educating myself, learning and unlearning for 30 days just to get myself started, and put different resources I saw, different podcasts, articles, documentaries into a plan of what I could do each day for the month of June, and then gave it a little more formatting with 10 minutes, 25 minutes, and 45 minutes. And then, of course, because I didn't want to be contributing to the problem, I want to be part of the solution, I asked Bree, and she graciously agreed to give her oversight and insight into the resources I'd selected and was promoting to make sure they did align with the BLM and were not promoting any problematic viewpoints that I was just thinking might be useful but aren't actually relevant from voices in the Black community. And after that, Bree can elaborate, but it resonated with a lot of folks.
Yeah, and from there, we just shared it to our social media. One day we're like, cool, 30 shares, a few retweets, we made a joint Twitter, and then it went viral from there. So in less than a week, over 1.1 million impressions on Twitter, ended up in the Washington Post, a few different articles. And for us, it was extremely encouraging because it showed that there was a need for people who were feeling overwhelmed and paralyzed by all the information circulating 20 different books, all these different articles, podcasts, and this was a way to make it tangible, to make it achievable, and to just move the needle forward. And it was always designed as a starting place. And so now we're building upon that traction and making sure that we can still commit to pumping out new tools and resources to move it forward.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that's so important. Just, kind of as an outsider looking in, resources, I think was a big thing that was, it's kind of hard to just get started. So it's great to see you guys doing that. Now, Dr. Little, you've been kind of working in this space for a while now. Can you kind of, talk about your background, kind of the timeline, and personally, I'm just curious, how you think everything's transpired in the last year or so.
Thank you so much for that question, Jimmy. And I just, again, want to applaud Brianna and Autumn, not only on their advocacy and their activism, but the personalization of that. And I think that that is where all of our work has to begin, with our own personal journey and narrative. And I think it informs us in different ways, but it also allows us to be threaded together and woven together as one community. So each of our journeys does not have to look the same, but we can be marching toward the same outcome. And so for me, my journey is very much, I say hodgepodge, but I actually started USC as an undergraduate, although I am a graduate and of the Graduate School, Rossier School of Education. But I started, born and raised in Compton, California, and actually entered college a year early. So I came to USC as a 16-year-old from right up the street, but it was vastly different culturally. And actually, I didn't do as well academically. I was smart, but it was very different for me in terms of being first generation, really adapting. And so early on, I understood just from my own walk through education that it wasn't always about the individual student, but also the resources, the access, the systems that are in place to ensure that everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed. And so after being at USC for about 3 years and not doing so well and actually ending up on academic probation, I went across town to California State University, Los Angeles, thinking I would go very briefly to go and raise my GPA. Went there and actually stayed and absolutely loved it. And one of the main reasons was that it was an affirming community. I saw people who looked like me. I saw people who affirmed my interest. I began to do research and really looking at, I completely changed my major, but I switched over to organizational behavior, organizational communication. And some of my early research was talking about these vast differences of leadership and how people engaged in the workspace, but they were using it very stereotypically. And it really bothered me. And one of my mentors said, if that is bothersome to you, then you need to do your own research and go and pursue your graduate degree. And that's eventually what I did to begin to study rhetoric and race. And I became a critical race scholar and really understood how we craft narratives that perpetuate systems that maintain power. And I think it's very important as we engage in this conversation around diversity, equity, inclusion, and really building on the foundation that Brianna and Autumn talked about, is where can our voice be heard? And what I loved about Autumn's story and saying the question that Brianna asked her about making it personal, if it were me. And I think that is why we have to look at this beyond entrenched identities, but look from a humanity perspective. If it were, and you fill in the blank, how do we really establish and sustain empathy and compassion for one another? And I'll talk later about where does that manifest in the workplace, but that's really how I began to get more engaged in this work.
Thank you so much for sharing. That's a very interesting story, and I'm glad that you were able to share your background. So Brianna and Autumn, I guess, the work that you guys did kind of centered around Autumn, you being an ally and being curious about how you can help as an ally and where, you can, put in your contribution and help for the cause as well. So not specifically for you both, I am curious to hear about, Dr. Little, your opinion as well, but, what does it mean to really be an ally, and how can an ally help in a situation like this? Anyone can go. Yeah.
I can start it off. I think, being in one of the groups that is most affected by racial injustice and systemic oppression, being an ally means doing more than just checking a box. Something that Autumn and I really like to talk about is the idea of finding your lane. And the road and journey of allyship, it shouldn't and often won't look the same as the person next to you. We have all lived experiences that are valid to how we view the world and how we interact with other people. And that will dictate what we find impactful in this space. So whether for someone that's protesting, whether that's donating, that's having those conversations, doing the work internally and extending it to our other different spheres, all of those lanes are valid, and we should all be on the same road working towards the same end goal, to honestly a destination that we never reach. And it's a lifestyle, it's something that evolves. And so being an ally means that you're taking the time to always do the learning and unlearning, and to confront the obstacles that you may have from whatever, that place that stemmed from, whether it's the community you were brought up in, the parents that nurtured you, the information that you received, the lack or increased diversity that you had, and how that can contribute to how you work as an ally. I know that I still have things to learn for other communities. So, no one is excluded from that space, and it will look different for everyone, but it really means taking the time to dig in and be willing to always show up and do that work.
I think for me, what I like to think about my allyship is it's active empathy. And so Brie and I like to call it compassion, whereas you move beyond empathy to compassion, where you're not only recognizing or saying, oh, that sucks, like this is really messed up what's happening, but then you want to be part of that solution so that you don't have to tomorrow wake up and be like, oh, that sucks, this shouldn't be happening, that you can be part of preventing it from happening in the future. And I am also a very practical person. I sometimes get a little bit caught up in, okay, what are the practical check boxes if I need to do this, I need to do this. And so this has been more of a challenging thing just personally, because as Bree just pointed out, you cannot check the box of allyship and be like, great, today I am no longer racist. Like, it's an ongoing thing that you will work at every day and you're never going to be perfect in. And that's a very, very tough pill for me to swallow. But I think what I've been able to find empowerment in is that it's active and it's me being part of that solution. And even if that's just every day attempting to have a conversation where I'm like, okay, cool. In every interaction I'm having, I know that I'm going to bring this perspective, and I know that I'm going to challenge someone's belief if they are saying something that is not progressing our society forward. And so for me, that helps simplify a little bit, because it is overwhelming, as Bree said, when you don't necessarily know your lane or you haven't found the best fit for you and how you want to be part of the solution, you can get paralyzed by, I'm not doing enough and there's so many things to do. But I think for me, the baseline ally, the base way everyone can be an ally is just bringing that into their conversations and just nudging that needle of whoever they're talking to, whoever they're meeting, just a little bit further in the direction of progress.
Well, I really do agree with everything that's been said. And I think also we need to question, what is our why of wanting to be an ally? Why do we feel that it's important? And as was stated earlier, each of us, because of intersectional identity, we will have to not always be representative of any primary group. And so when those times when you are not in privilege, or when others are not in privilege and have agency or power, how do you step in and step up? And I go back and forth with this notion of ally, because sometimes it gives the impression that I'm standing on the sidelines and I'm here to support you, which sometimes can be paternalistic in a perception. And I've heard, terms like co-conspirator, but basically it's the sentiment that each of you have shared about being active, being engaged, and standing up for something, right? Making sure people know this matters to me, not merely because of my relationship with my best friend or with my family or with my coworker, but because it matters to me. It's not right for me. And I just really, really think that that's important for each of us to understand, what does allyship look like operationally, not just theoretically. And as was stated, it's a journey. It continues, it changes, it morphs. So I think each of us must continue to do our personal work, listen and learn and unlearn on how we can do the collective work as well.
Thank you all for your responses. Obviously it makes sense. And I think kind of talking at a bare bones level, we know that it's all important and everything that we're discussing matters, but I would like to hear your opinions, starting with Dr. Little, if you could. Why is it important? Why is diversity, equity, inclusion, why is it so significant and, being so heavily discussed right now?
Well, I think when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion as a side topic, people get confused. I think that there is no topic, especially in business, that we can look at without centralizing diversity, equity, and inclusion. We are all diverse. We all bring our own individual identity, our intersectional identity to any space. So the diversity in and of itself is not the issue. Oftentimes when we think about difference, it's not the difference, but it's the meaning we make of it. And so when we allow difference to be perceived as something opposite of me or separate from me, we begin to otherize others. Then we create systems, or we perpetuate systems and behavior that begin to manifest division. And that's why inclusion is needed, because we've created systems, perpetuated systems that sometimes identify either based upon power or identity constructs, who belongs and who does not. And so if we say, when we come together, we already accept, right? Diversity is a fact, inclusion is a choice. So once we come together, what knowledge, tools, and skills do we have to humanely, empathetically, compassionately interact with one another? And it doesn't mean that it's conflict-free. It doesn't mean that we have to be monolithic or have groupthink, but it means that I'm intentional about identifying ways in which to better engage, better see, better understand one another, and then move about those relationships, that workplace, that society, in a manner in which that best honors one another.
Yeah, wow. I mean, that was amazing, and 100% to every piece of that. And I think to build upon it, it's really important to recognize that diversity is beyond just racial or ethnic diversity. I think a lot of people pigeonhole that definition into just everyone shouldn't look the same, but it's also in mindset, it's in background, it's in upbringing, it's in intellectual capacity and the, skill sets we bring to the table. And that is comprising of who's in the room. Inclusion is putting that into action, but equity is also looking at our systems and structures and altering them so that the playing field is leveled for everyone, no matter where they're starting. So I think, we need to evolve how we look at diversity. And as someone who works in a corporate setting, I see how taking that and centralizing it, like Dr. Little said, it's statistically proven that your profits will increase if you have a more diverse workforce. So it's out there and it's factual. It's just taking the effort to going and looking at, what existing in our workplace, in our structure is not working. How can we diversify it and how can we continue to evolve it? And again, still go beyond that checkbox.
Okay, perfect. Autumn, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Nothing in particular. I think it was I even wrote down that diversity is a given, inclusion is a choice. I was like, oh,
Yeah,
what a gem. So I don't want to follow that.
Yeah, that's very powerful. And we did have a question come in that is pretty similar to what we were gonna, kind of bring up next. But similarly, being in a corporate environment, a lot of the companies that I have worked for in the past, upper management looked a lot like, like none of us, to be frank. And they all kind of look fairly similar. So, kind of talking about, diversity, equity, and inclusion and how it directly applies to, being in the workforce and being in a company. How do those conversations start if a company might not be so diverse, and where do you see those conversations going?
Yeah, I can jump in here. I have a leadership team that looks relatively the same. It's diverse in the sense of gender, but there's something about empowering those who are in those entry and middle levels to also catalyze the change, because at the end of the day, there will be a ceiling, but if there's push from the people who are moving the business forward, there's no excuse not to pay attention to it. I think it's also, finding those little spaces and figuring out where do you have an opportunity to exercise your privilege? What rooms are you in where you can speak up for the person that's not in that room but should be? And that's how you slowly move the needle, by recognizing where you have the space to create an opportunity for an improvement, and understand that everyone's voice does matter and hold weight, right? From the most progressive companies to even the most conservative. And making those small changes, and being aware and just being perceptive of where the flaws are can help open up where the opportunities lie.
And I would even add on to that too, to say, like, going back, the why is such an important question of why does that employee base maybe not even reflect the diversity of where you're at? And again, I grew up in the Midwest, so our ethnic diversity is much different than that of LA or the East Coast even, but it's where, and then why does it not reflect it? And then are you committed to having it reflect that in the long run? Because it's very difficult to make those changes overnight of just, and again, you don't want to fall into the performative action of like, oh, well, now we have the person that we can put on our brochure that shows like, yes, we're a diverse workplace. And I would say looking at the hiring practices, the actual language can even just be off-putting to certain groups where they're like, oh, well, I would never qualify for XYZ because of the specific rhetoric being used. And then where are those advertisements, those job postings being made? Maybe there does need to be a concerted effort to go into areas where the postings aren't normally reaching, or whatever's currently the status quo probably needs to evolve and become something different because it's not reflected currently. And so I look definitely to just why is that not happening right now? And then how can we change the specific language around elevating those voices, like Bree said, and bringing those people into the room and to the table?
And I would just add that we have to be honest about the intentionality of the composition of many workplaces, and that it doesn't just happen by chance. And it's not merely because one group, one gender, one any aspect of identity is more intellectual. And oftentimes it's difficult to unpack that, because the assumption would be that if we see 90% of CEOs are white males, that must mean something, and that it did not happen, because someone set it up that way. But it was set up that way. And I think the difficulty in having these conversations in the workplace is because people often think you have to subtract to add. And I don't think that you have to do that. You have to be honest. You still have to create community, though. And so you have to show everyone across the continuum, why is this a value add for us to be thoughtful about the systems that have been created, how they got that way. Yes, the operation is still moving forward, but what else are we losing? If we do basic gap analysis, right? And we look at, are we demotivating many of our team? Because people want to focus, for example, on recruitment. And as Autumn said, it is essential. But you also have to be thoughtful about retention, because you will get this wheel where people will come in, but they're not genuinely welcomed, or they hit all of these ceilings, glass, brick, any kind of steel, where they cannot fully reflect all of the talent that they bring, and they never see themselves in any other aspect of the organization. And so if you want to truly have inclusion and equity, it has to start not only at the quote unquote top, but it has to be authentically operationalized across the organization. And I also think, going back to our previous question, we have to be very specific in our actions. So we hear a lot now around anti-Blackness, but we need to shift to pro-Blackness, right? Because the difference is, and we can fill in any other aspect of diversity and identity, but the difference is one is more preventive from a deficit perspective, and one is more affirming from a strengths perspective. And when you begin to tell those authentic narratives, then you see the intentionality of how they were erased. So instead of trying to say, oh no, Black people matter, it's about how have we gotten to a place where we've not affirmed the contributions. For women, it's not that we want people to recognize or see women. We want you to recognize and see women across the diversity of women, but also ask, why were there systems in place that disallowed them to fully engage? And even now, as the population majority, still do not have equity, pay equity, right? Leadership equity. So that's where we have to move into those honest conversations.
Those are very good points. And we did have a follow-up question to all that. So this question stated, one issue is that the industry I'm in isn't diverse in general. What do you do when you post a job opening and 90% of the applicants are white males? The applicant pool isn't really representative of society in general. And I'm not sure if any of you might have, the right answer for that.
I would say it's a both and. Go ahead, Autumn.
Oh, I was just going to say, so speaking from the work I currently do, I'm trying to invest in kids as young as 12 and 13 to see that you are not stupid because you haven't understood this before. It was that someone didn't take the time to help you learn it in your style. So I'm working on the long-term solution of helping these kids stick with STEM or stick with whatever actually excites them and they want to work on. But they're definitely education in general, and I could go off on a very long tangent about this, but I'm one of two teachers of color in the building, and some of my students even this year have been like, you're the first person I've ever asked about their experience in life or the way you walk through life because you look like me. So I think there's definitely a lot of work to do just with how do we show kids that they can go into those roles and fulfill those roles. And that's something I'm trying to work on every day with my students, but yeah, it's more of a long-term investment that I'm doing right now.
I thank you so much, Autumn, because I think you never get to long-term without the short-term, and without you actually making that commitment right now, we would never see some of the change that we need to see. I think it's a twofold strategy. Most definitely, we need to address. And I'm sure you all heard a few weeks ago when a CEO said, we can't find the talent. And then this onrush came on. Sometimes it is difficult in certain fields to acknowledge that, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And if it doesn't exist, then we have to go back to ask the question, why doesn't it exist, right? To Autumn's point, what educational systems have precluded young people from recognizing their brilliance in science and in math when their history demonstrates something different, right? So if we've intentionally ignored history and the pyramids and many regions of the world that have contributed, then that is also an assault on one's identity. But I also think we have to ensure that whoever is in charge, whoever is being hired, we must hold them also to a standard of understanding inclusion and equity. And we often think it can only come in the form of a person of color or in gender identity or ability or any form of identity. That lets people off the hook. It's either we're all in or we are all going to lose if we don't commit. So we all need to be developed. None of us are perfect. There is no end game. So every person who has a role in the organization should be equipped to ask these equity questions. And then when they're in positions of power, begin to seek out ways in which to change the image.
I think that's, extremely important, everything you just mentioned. Brianna, did you have anything you wanted to follow up with?
No, I think they hit the nail on the head.
Okay. Dr. Little, I am curious, because you've obviously been seeing this way longer than myself and, Brianna and Autumn. And, I'm curious.
Seasoned, Jimmy. Yes. Okay.
I'm trying to tiptoe around the question a little bit, but, I am interested to see, have things changed over the last 2-3 years with, social media? And I mean, just looking back even further, 5-10 years, have you noticed any significant differences that might be better or worse?
We see cycles, right? These are not new conversations. And one of the things when I'm sharing around diversity, equity, and inclusion is understanding history. So when we see children caged, we can go right to the Japanese internment. We can go right to American enslavement. When we talk about erasure, when we think about immigration policies, and we know that there was Chinese immigration prohibition back in the late 1800s, after they had helped to build the railroads. So one of the things we have to do is to look at patterns. I often say history does not repeat itself, human beings repeat history. So if you want to look at the change, yes, I do believe that we grow and we've seen insights, but I go back to the point of intentionality. We don't take a long time to make decisions in many other areas, especially within organizations. It doesn't take 10 years to figure out a technology strategy, expansion strategy, financial strategy. It does not take 10 years to figure out an inclusion strategy. We're not lacking strategies, we're lacking will. And so, yes, we are growing, but it takes really individuals to stand up and say, what will I tolerate in my space? And I think within the organization, what I have found both at the university and in the corporate space is that when you create a sense of community and invite everyone in, have those hard conversations, but not burn the house down while you're in it, which means that you engage in shame and blame and victim and oppressor, you are more willing to hear me and to see me if I come and create community. And if you don't want to do the work, then let's just be honest and stop wasting our time. But I think Justice in June is a definite way that we begin to see movement because no one lets anyone off. And it's a community builder.
That's great. Yeah. Just thinking back, I mean, I always have weekly meetings about, reports and, getting updates and trying to figure out how we can improve. But yeah, that's a good point. We don't really have discussions about all the things that are important. So I'll have one last question before we open it up for Q&A. But, any lasting comments from you three and just, why it is important for us to continue this work. And I know you mentioned there really is no end goal, but what would it look like to kind of get closer to something like that?
Wow. For me personally, I think it comes from a place where everyone is at least at the level of awareness and recognition. I have found over the past few months, a lot of people who have said, "Oh, I'm so surprised, I'm so shocked." Whereas people who are in these communities and affected daily by actions or inaction are not surprised and they are not shocked. And if anything, they've become, like I similarly was, desensitized to what's going on. But in order to get to that place of awareness, it takes a level of being perceptive in the beginning and in the first place. Being willing to open your eyes and being able to turn away comes from a place of privilege, and recognizing that first, that I could choose to turn away if I so please, but I'm not going to. And I'm going to sit in that discomfort, and I'm going to figure out where my roadblocks are, and I'm going to tear them down so that I can be an advocate for other people who are behind because of how our systems and structures are created. So while the end goal, right, is something that we don't reach, I would love to not have to explain, racial injustice to my kids. I would love to be able to raise them that everyone can and should be treated equally, and then our systems reflect that. And until we can get to that place, until kids don't have to be perceptive at such a young age that, oh, I'm different, so someone's going to treat me differently because of that, or I'm less worthy because of that, until we can get to that place, then there's so much more work to do. And that's what drives me, is that all of this work, whatever happens in life, my lifetime, I want to see what happens for the future generations. I want to see my brother and sister move from a place of apathy to hope and to inspiration, and trusting the people that are in power and trusting the systems that are in place, that we can actually navigate through those and see change.
I'll just add one piece, kind of building on what Brianna is saying in terms of wanting some generational change. So I have twin boys who are 22, and it was very painful to really understand that my mother, who lived in California during 1965, experienced uprising. I experienced uprising in 92. My children are experiencing in 2020. And you may say, okay, the ebbs and flows, but that's generational trauma. Because you have these not only memories, but experiences. And everything from the talk and having to be concerned about my children when they leave home, and actually being in the car with them, and also navigating multiple relationships. Their godfather is a police officer, so it's not about anti-law enforcement. We have a lot of military in our family, so I think most families are complex. It's about, how do you not walk around with this perpetual sense of surveillance? And what is the cost to you mentally, physically, emotionally of living that way? And that's why the perspective taking is so important. And it doesn't have to just be around race. Think about and have empathy about someone with ability, right? We are very much ableist. So if you think about going to the ATM, if you think about most aspects of your life, if you are not differently abled, it just becomes something that you expect. But when you can really experience and understand the challenges that people have merely because of how they were born into this world. We had the Crown Act passed in 2020. How my hair grows out of my head will dictate the opportunities that I may have in terms of my employment to take care of myself, no matter how intellectual I am. Those are real conversations we have to ask and really collectively say. The poem, right? Today they came for Autumn, I didn't say anything. Today they came for Brianna, I didn't say anything. Today they came for Jimmy, I didn't say anything. When they came for me, no one was there. And we have to take that ownership.
Well, I'm glad this is being recorded. I'm going to have to go back and take notes on all this. Autumn, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I think I would just like people to be I would just like to solve different problems. And I haven't been in this nearly as long as some folks, so that's a privilege to even say that. But I'm excited to solve problems that are that are impacting every single human on this planet, besides ones that we've been trying to solve and move forward. I'm just tired of repeating that. Because it would be so much more exciting to me for seeing my students and seeing even my cohort and my younger sister just realizing their full potential as a human of this is how I contribute. This is how I meaningfully apply my talents to the world in service of humanity. That is so fulfilling when you find that work and when you're just on fire. Your passion is what you're pursuing. And I feel like so many people never, ever experience a taste of that. They don't know how fulfilled they can be in that potential. They haven't reached that potential because we're dealing with just petty things that should have no bearing on our experience from our day-to-day, but they do. And again, they're entrenched in things that are bigger than just the individual. So that is a unique challenge of this discussion and racial injustice, because it will take all of us to make a difference on that systemic level. But I would just really like to see a future like in the decade where we're all focusing on actual problems facing humanity instead of ones that we've already identified and know how to solve, and then we somehow just can't bridge that gap, or we're all not coming together as a collective to address that systemic ongoing piece. Because I want my students to grow up, graduate high school, and go into a world where they get to live up to their full potential and they find that passion, and that's the thing they're pursuing. And their challenges all have to do with what do I choose to do with my talents? That's the challenge. That's the stressor they're facing. Not, I'm limited to these things that I can do because of how I look, how I walk, the hat I wear, and the identity I hold in this world.
Very powerful.
Yep. Thank you all for that. So we did have some questions come in. So the first one, when it comes to working with organizations, are there assessment tools that you find helpful?
Well, I will share. I think that there are multiple instruments and ways in which you can assess, for example, inclusion. You just have to, again, go back to why are you doing this and what are you trying to identify? So there are engagement tools or surveys about how people are really staying engaged in the workplace. It's not necessarily merely an inclusion survey, but it gives some insight because, again, if we use the gap analysis as an example, I can be on Zoom or be in a workspace from 8 to 5 physically, but emotionally and mentally, am I there? Or if I'm constantly thinking about in the meeting, to Autumn's point, not bringing my full potential and just brainstorming and sharing and strategizing, but I'm so concerned how people are going to perceive what I say because of who I am, or will it be validated because of who I am, or saying something not being affirmed, but someone else says it and they get the recognition. All of those things are like little nicks. I call it like a hard drive on a computer. Those files don't go away, they accumulate. And so when you think about people's trauma or the weight of that, right? If you think about walking through life, we need to really lift the weight. We need to really allow people. And so engagement, inclusion instruments, there is something called the IDI, which will do an assessment of our own intercultural abilities, our emotional intelligence, the way in which we think. But we also have to recognize it's ongoing. It is not an endpoint. Just like we hope that we continue to develop as human beings, we have to continue to develop core skills, listening. Miss Diversity professor, I'll quickly share this story. I got on the train one night going home from school. Some young people got on dressed in black. I've shared this story before. And because of my upbringing and my religious background upbringing, I was like, oh, they must listen to certain music and they may try to harm me. Those kids got off the train, went their way, but I had to check myself and say, what was that about? And it never harmed them in that context because they didn't know what I was thinking. But what if they had been my students in my classroom? It could have definitely harmed them, not just in that semester, but maybe throughout their life. So we really have to be cognizant of not only the power we have and the voice we have, but our own checking of ourselves, our biases, our conversations. And look, we know when we're engaging in some thoughts or behaviors, there's an internal check. and we just have to be honest and move on.
And I think something, just again, not speaking from a professional background at all, but something I've observed as Bria and I have worked through this together, when people discover something for themselves, like when they're coming on this discovery, even if you're like really holding their hand all the way there, it's much more, there's much more buy-in. And so a couple things that people have given us feedback on that's been useful is doing their own bias test, where you can take one and it will tell you, hey, this is, I mean, as good as it can be. It'll tell you where you fall on whatever spectrum with whatever bias you're testing. And that was really eye-opening, even for some of my friends from the USC cohort who are like, wow, I have always thought of myself as not having this behavior or this bias. And then I took this and it turns out I actually have a little more of it internalized than I thought. And I think that was a more tangible way to for them to grab on to like, okay, this is what I need to work on. As well as once they understood where they started from their own intrinsic motivation, then they were able to say, okay, what are the steps to break that down, and could retake it. So you can kind of track progress. Because again, it's difficult when there's not a checkbox, but being able to see growth and see progress. So as much as you can encourage, like to Jimmy's point, like they have weekly report meetings, they have weekly meetings on this. Maybe you do have a monthly check-in where people are seeing like, hey, I wrote this statement about something at the beginning of the year. And now at the end of the year, I'm reading that statement back and I actually don't agree with what my initial perspective was. And that's something we use in teaching all the time as a way for our students to be like, oh, I have learned something. I have really covered a lot of material in X number of weeks or months. But them writing it out, them coming to the realization is what's essential about that. So as much as you can, making the assessment or making that checkpoint, that check-in, one of self-discovery or like motivated by that individual, then they'll have more buy-in, I think. And it could be more meaningful in creating, again, that more authentic experience where people think it's real and think it is genuine, instead of like, oh, our HR is pushing this, or outside events are pushing this curriculum or this conversation.
Thank you. Brianna, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I want us to be able to get through a few more questions.
Okay. Well, the next one is, if you are working with white colleagues, how can you support / help them develop empathy? Brianna, would you want to go first for that?
Yeah, sure. I think first recognizing that you can't force anyone to empathize with a situation, circumstance, or lived experience. However, you can plant the seed. I think one, in order to avoid compassion fatigue, right, or burnout that comes from overexerting yourself or consuming traumatic material and then trying to do all these different things to fix what you're seeing, right? Understand and recognize that not every conversation you have or not every interaction you have is going to go the same depth or the same distance. And understanding that you might just be that person that plants the seed, and maybe 2, 3, 4 people or conversations down the line, they get it. They have that epiphany. And you have now marked yourself as someone who's safe and who's someone who comes from a place of compassion to be able to further along that conversation. And I think, when you're looking at, white colleagues, right, or friends, recognizing and telling them that, I think explaining something that Autumn and I have found really helpful is explaining the concept of white privilege and the very basic skeleton of what that is, and how it doesn't mean that anyone's life wasn't hard, that there weren't challenges, that skin color just wasn't the reason why any of those challenges existed. Reframing that for people has allowed them to reassess how they view a lot of the different movements we see taking place. And then saying, just because you come from a place of privilege doesn't mean that should stop you from getting better. It doesn't mean that you can't exercise, ways to move things forward and be an advocate, again, for those people that aren't in the room, that aren't in those spaces. So just understanding, that sometimes it's just planting the seed, and not getting frustrated when you do hit those walls, and that hopefully that person at some point down the line does get to make that full circle of understanding.
That's great. Autumn or Dr. Little, would you want to add to that at all?
She said it all for me.
Yeah, that was well said. Okay, we can move on to the next question. So, how can men, especially men of color, tangibly support women of color in the workplace and the spaces we co-occupy?
That's an amazing question, but does anyone else want to go first before I dive in again? First of all, I think recognizing, like Dr. Little said, the importance of intersectionality. So we all come with the different parts of our existence that inform our experience. I'm a woman, but I'm also a woman of color. I'm a Black woman. I grew up in suburban Orange County. My father's an immigrant, and I have two different ethnic identities and one racial identity. And so that all informs my experience. So as a man or a man of color, recognizing one, there are going to likely be gender disparities, and two, added upon that, racial or ethnic disparities, recognizing those first, and then seeing where you can utilize maybe where you might be more advanced in the space to open up that door. If it's all men in a room and there's not a woman of color or a woman in general represented, why is that? And can you now push to make space for that to no longer be the case? And it's very convoluted, and it depends on what sphere you're in, and it depends on, you know, what those systems and structures are in place. But recognizing first where you have the opportunity to move the needle and where you just need to stand in solidarity, and that it's going to have to evolve. It's not, I hope that's not the most clear answer, because it's not, you know, a clear idea, but there are always going to be spaces where some of us are above someone else, you know, or just have a higher viewpoint, and allowing that and extending that to someone else, and then figuring out where you can stand alongside them and amplify voices is where there's room for opportunity.
If I just may quickly add, I think what that question, I really appreciate that question, because what I read from it is, how can I stand up when it really matters? And to me, I always say it doesn't matter until it matters. And we can have, you know, side conversations behind closed walls or in our rooms, but until it really can impact from your whatever position of privilege or agency, that's when it matters. And to Brianna's point, if you're sitting in a room, I've been in meetings where I'm the absolute only person of color out of 24 people. Guess what's happening? I'm thinking about, why is this the case? And I could go one or two ways. I can say, oh, I'm so special. No, I'm not that special. Now, I may be exceptional, but not in that sense. And so we also have to call out rationales and narratives that seek to justify oppression, because sometimes that's how systems pit people and identities against one another. And that's dangerous, because it'll say, well, if you stand up for this person, it's going to come at your expense. And that really is a dangerous game, because as I said, at the end of the day, it will come full circle. And I think we all must stand up. Of course, there, as Brianna said, in her dual ethnic identity and her racial identity, there will be some people who will be more aligned with experience. But even if you're not aligned with experience, be aligned with the humanity and stand up when you can. And I know it's not always easy, but as was already stated, and with the example again of Justice in June, your lane may look different. It may be affirming a woman of color to say your voice matters, even if you can't go and question the leadership.
Well, thank you. That was all extremely powerful. Autumn, would you like anything to add to that? No? Okay. We did have one last question I think we can get to, but I think it's to you, Dr. Little, but someone was asking if you can tell us about the books behind you.
Oh, sure. Don't get me started. It's late though. But Race Matters, Cornell West, and he has a lot of different books. But in writing my dissertation, I, as I said, I'm a critical race theorist, Daryl Wing Sue. If you don't know him, he talks all about microaggressions and how bias manifests. And he is a thought leader. And this is Race Talk and the Conspiracy of Silence. Really, how do we facilitate these conversations and difficult dialogues? Because it's not easy. And that's where you have to model humanity. And people are sometimes thrown off by me. They walk in and they make assumptions. Oh, she's a Black female. I know she's going to come in and just tear into us. Oh, I'm going to tear into the systems and I may pull an ear here. But guess what? If I divide us, that's not going to get us anywhere. I still have to speak truth to power, but also cultivate and model community, because you need me and I need you. And so let's break down all of our own biases. And to Autumn's point, let's see about what the possibilities of the world are. Let's resolve some issues. And this is strategic diversity leadership, because I think any conversation around DEI, anti-racism, pro-Blackness has to be strategic. It will not be one size fits all. And you have to always start with the basics: who, what, where, when, how, but why.
Wow, I think that's a great way to end the event. You know, I'm really thankful and appreciative you three were, able to take the time to speak to all of us. I definitely recognize, I'm someone where I'm fortunate enough to, essentially put on a hat. Like you all mentioned, I can put on a hat when I want to care about, certain issues and when I don't want to, and it wouldn't affect me either way. So, being able to hear about your experiences, all your work, it's really inspiring. And I'm, very thankful that you guys shared with all of us today. But Christina, would you be able to share everyone's contact info? Yes. So if you weren't able to, ask a question, or if you wanted to, be a little bit more personable, everyone's information's on here if you wanted to reach out through email and, different sources as well. But, again, thank you to all of our panelists for coming out and spending the time with us. And, thank you to all of the attendees as well for taking the time today. But with that, I think we're at the top of the hour. So, thank you all again, and fight on.